Chinese leg bandaging. The girl's body was bent against her will. Her bones were broken by hand, pressed tightly against the sole of her foot, and wrapped with long strips of cloth so that her foot was twisted inward, turning into a small, deformed stump. She screamed in pain, but her mother, grandmother, or neighbors continued the ritual. The screams were part of the process, like the blood and the smell of pus. Over many long months and years, the little girl's foot had to be transformed into an elegant symbol of beauty, a lotus foot. This was the name given to one of the most horrific traditions of Chinese civilization, foot binding. The first mentions of it date back to the 10th century, during the Song dynasty. Legends link the ritual to the concubine of Emperor Li Yu, who danced in lotus-shaped shoes with her feet bound. The story quickly turned into a myth about female beauty and refinement. But behind the myth lay violence. By the 11th and 12th centuries, the practice had spread among the nobility and then gradually spread to commoners. Feet had to be no more than 8 to 10 centimeters long. To achieve this, all toes except the big toe were bent under the sole, breaking the joints and pressing them tightly against the arch of the foot with tight bandages. The procedure began early, at the age of 4 to 6, when the bones were still soft. The girl was seated, her feet were washed with herbal decoctions, and the toes were bent toward the heel. The bandages were wrapped tighter every day. After a few weeks, bleeding wounds appeared, the nails grew into the skin, and the tissue rotted. The smell of pus became a familiar background noise in the house. But her parents did not stop the process. On the contrary, it was believed that if the girl did not endure it, she would ruin her fate. She would not be married and would dishonor her family. The pain was constant. The girls could not walk normally. They fell and clung to the walls. Their bones broke slowly, with a creaking sound. Sometimes the process lasted for years. The bandages were removed only to cut away the dead flesh, wash out the pus, and wrap them even tighter. Clothes and shoes were always soaked with blood and pus. Many children died from infection. But death was seen as a tragic but acceptable price to pay for beauty. The social system pushed families into this painful ritual. In traditional China, a successful marriage was the main condition for a woman's survival. Men sought brides with golden lotuses, small deformed feet. It was believed that such a wife would be more submissive, walk less, and become dependent and attached to the home. For poor families, binding their daughters' feet was a chance to marry a richer man. Thus, the practice spread not only among the elite, but also in villages, where girls suffered just as much. Sexual connotations also played a role. Small feet became a fetish. Men believed that lotus feet were arousing, and the gait of a woman with bound feet, unsteady, slow, as if dancing, was considered particularly seductive. Texts from the Ming and Qing dynasties describe 3 inches of gold as a symbol of passion. Women's shoes for bound feet were decorated with embroidery and precious stones, becoming collector's items, and men wrote poems and treatises on the perfect beauty of small feet. The medicine of the time did not see this as a disease. On the contrary, doctors and philosophers wrote that binding tames a woman's excess energy and restrains her nature. Just as in Europe, female sexuality was suppressed by clitoridectomy or therapeutic sex, in China it was restrained by bandages. The idea of controlling women's bodies in the name of morality became global, and the Chinese version of this idea foot binding, was one of the most painful. Women who underwent this process were permanently disabled. Their gait was painful. They could not stand or work for long periods of time. Often their feet rotted, their toes fell off, and their skin became covered with sores. But it was precisely this weakness that was perceived as a virtue. A woman was supposed to be helpless and dependent. By the 18th–19th centuries, foot binding had become almost universal. According to historians, more than half of Chinese women had bound feet, and in some regions, up to 90%. Girls suffered from pain, their mothers and grandmothers supported the ritual, and men admired the 3-inch lotuses. The system was self-perpetuating, and it was impossible to escape. Thus, foot binding became one of the most widespread forms of torture, legitimized by culture. It combined everything: physical pain, social pressure, religious justifications, and sexual fetishism. And it lasted for almost 1,000 years. The heyday of foot binding came during the Ming and especially the Qing dynasties, when the practice spread to almost all strata of Chinese society, except for some ethnic minorities and the poorest peasants, who needed women's labor in the fields. In cities and among landowners, small lotus feet became an absolute marker of status, beauty, and virtue. During this period, foot binding finally became a symbol of cultural identity. A girl without bound feet was perceived as uncivilized or unworthy, and her chances of marriage were virtually nil. Mothers and grandmothers, who had themselves gone through the bone-breaking ritual, became the main performers of the ritual for their daughters and granddaughters. This was a terrible paradox. Women themselves reproduced violence because they knew that without it, their children would be doomed to poverty and shame. Each stage of bandaging had its own horrors. Initially, the toes were bent under the foot and fixed with a long bandage soaked in herbal decoction, which was supposed to reduce the pain, but more often caused gangrene. Then the bandages were tightened more and more, day after day. Fingers broke, joints cracked, and bones slowly changed shape. Sometimes the girls' arches were broken to make their feet shorter. After several months, the leg turned into a bleeding wound. Pus oozed out, the bandages were soaked with blood, and the smell was so strong that the girls could not sleep because of the stench. But there was no turning back. Their mothers urged them on, threatened them, and reminded them that their future depended on it. European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries described what they saw with horror. Jesuit missionaries reported that little girls were held like prisoners, and their feet were tortured daily until they resembled a piece of meat wrapped in cloth. An 18th century English merchant wrote, "I saw a girl of about 7 walking across the courtyard. Every step was agony, and she clung to the walls to keep from falling. Her mother, proud, said to me, 'Soon she will be a real woman.'" To Europeans this seemed barbaric, but to Chinese society it was a necessity. The size of the foot was of particular importance. The ideal was considered to be 3 inches of gold, about 8 centimeters. The smaller the foot, the higher the value of the girl on the marriage market. Men chose their wives by looking at their shoes. Tiny, delicate shoes with embroidery became a symbol of status. Rich families kept dozens of pairs of such shoes as precious jewels. They were decorated with pearls, gold threads, and precious stones. The very fact of owning a woman with a 3-inch lotus became a source of pride and a demonstration of wealth. Female sexuality in this system was suppressed and at the same time turned into an object of fetishism. Men believed that small feet made women more seductive, and their gait, slow, unsteady as if dancing, was considered a dance of passion. Erotic treatises from the Ming Dynasty contained descriptions of intimate practices involving bandaged feet. Men kissed and sniffed them, inhaling the smell of sweat and decay, which was perceived as arousing. The texts said that a woman with lotus feet aroused men more because her suffering made her body more pure and obedient. But behind this fetish lay everyday disability. Women with bandaged feet could not perform heavy work on their own and often could not even move without a cane or support. Their lives became a constant pain: calluses, ulcers, infections, bone loss. Many lost fingers or entire parts of their feet to gangrene. However, it was precisely this helplessness that was seen as a virtue. It made women dependent on their husbands and families. The ritual began at the age of 4, and by the age of 10, the foot was completely deformed. Girls became disabled before they even learned to be adults. In girls' schools, lessons were conducted while sitting, and crafts and writing were taught in a position that prevented them from standing or walking. And all of this was considered normal. By the 18th century, the practice had spread over vast territories. According to researchers, during the Qing dynasty, more than 80% of women of the Han ethnic group had bound feet. In some regions, this figure reached 95%. Only a few ethnic groups, the Manchus, Hakkas, and Tibetans, refused to participate in the ritual. But even there, women were discriminated against for having big feet. Thus, during the Ming and Qing dynasties, foot binding became not just a tradition, but a comprehensive system that determined a woman's fate. Every girl had to go through torture. Every mother had to become her executioner. And every man had to be her judge. And while men sang about lotuses in poems and women wore shoes the size of their palms, thousands of girls died from infection or were left crippled. The 19th century was a time when China first encountered persistent scrutiny from outside. Western powers, missionaries, doctors, and diplomats began to speak out loudly about foot binding as a barbaric custom. But for millions of Chinese families, this practice remained not just the norm, but the only chance for a girl to survive in a society where marriage was her destiny. In this contradiction, the ritual became a symbol. For foreigners, proof of China's backwardness. For the Chinese themselves, a marker of cultural identity that could not be rejected without fear of losing face in the future. European missionaries in the mid-19th century left dozens of reports describing what they saw. They wrote about rotten wounds, about women who could not walk properly, about girls being crippled in childhood. For Western medicine, this was an example of horrific violence against the body. Newspapers in London, Paris, and Berlin published articles about women with lotus feet, accompanying them with drawings of tiny shoes. In these texts, China was portrayed as a country where women's destinies were crippled for the sake of male lust and aesthetics. But inside China, the situation was different. Even after the Opium Wars and pressure from the West, foot binding remained a prerequisite for marriage for most Han families. In wealthy homes, a bride with unbound feet was considered a disgrace. Girls whose parents tried to free them from this torture were despised by their neighbors and called big-footed, a symbol of rural coarseness and poverty. In cities, such girls had virtually no chance of getting married. The medical realities of the 19th century were even more dire than before. In unsanitary conditions, thousands of girls died from blood poisoning. Doctors recorded cases of gangrene, sepsis, and amputations. But even the death of a child did not stop families. They began to bandage their next daughter, considering it an integral duty. Bandaging became as commonplace as feeding or dressing. The sexualization of this practice held a special place. In 19th century literature, men described small feet as objects of passion. In intimate diaries and erotic treatises, there are lines about the bliss of inhaling the scent of a shoe, or enjoying the gait of a woman who can barely walk. The smell of decay, pain, and sweat became a fetish, and the shoe became a symbol of male possession. In effect, women's pain and mutilation were turned into a commodity on the marriage market and a source of male fantasy. At the same time, the first voices against the tradition began to appear in China. Reformers associated with the modernization movement wrote pamphlets in which foot binding was called the most terrible disgrace of the nation. Intellectuals pointed out that it weakened women physically, deprived them of their ability to bear healthy children, and made society vulnerable. But their voices were drowned out by the tide of everyday life. Millions of families continued to bind their daughters because they knew that without it, their fate was sealed. For Western powers, foot binding became an argument in favor of colonial intervention. In 19th century diplomatic documents, China was described as a country where women are mutilated for the sake of lust. Europeans used this image to justify their wars and demands for reform. But the paradox was that European countries themselves had their own forms of violence against women, from factory slavery to medical operations to treat hysteria. By the end of the 19th century, the first organized movements against foot binding appeared. In 1895, the Unbound Feet Association was formed in Shanghai, whose members vowed not to marry girls with bound feet. Similar societies spread to cities, but were almost unknown in villages. There, everything remained the same. A 5-year-old girl, her screams, her mother's hand with a bandage, blood on rags, the smell of pus. Thus, the 19th century became a time when foot binding was simultaneously criticized and reached its peak as a mass practice. Millions of women lived with deformed feet, thousands died from infection, and thousands of men wrote poems about 3 inches of gold. In this grim duality, China entered the 20th century, where the fate of lotus feet was to be decided under the pressure of reforms, revolutions, and new ideologies. The early 20th century was a time when China's old traditions began to crack under the pressure of revolutions, wars, and social change. But foot binding, a 1,000-year-old form of torture, proved to be an incredibly resilient custom. Even when reformers and new governments declared it barbaric and tried to ban it, the cries of children could still be heard in the villages, and the smell of rot lingered in the houses. In 1902, Empress Cixi, who had herself been bound in her youth, signed a decree ordering the practice to be stopped. But her order had little effect. Provincial officials were reluctant to interfere in family affairs, and parents did not want to risk their daughters' future marriages. In 1912, after the fall of the empire and the proclamation of the Republic of China, Sun Yat-sen's new government once again banned foot binding. In girls' schools, inspections were introduced. If a student's foot was bound, she could be expelled. In cities, unbound foot organizations were created, and male members vowed not to marry women with mutilated feet. But outside the major centers, the tradition persisted. Cultural propaganda was particularly important. Newspapers and magazines of the New Culture Movement era published articles calling foot binding a national disgrace. Intellectuals wrote that China could not keep pace with the modern world while crippling its women. Posters depicted women with natural feet as a symbol of the future. But in everyday life, this did not change the situation. For peasant families, small feet remained a ticket to marriage, and marriage was a ticket to survival. The realities of those years were contradictory. In Beijing and Shanghai, girls with bandaged feet were ridiculed as backward. But in the villages of Henan and Sichuan, mothers continued to break their daughters' feet, considering it their duty. A girl without bandages in such places was considered ugly and useless. Social pressure was so strong that even families who believed in new ideas secretly bandaged their daughters' feet, so as not to condemn them to loneliness. Photographs from the early 20th century show a stark contrast. Young women in European dresses and shoes stand next to grandmothers with small, deformed lotus feet. These generations were separated by a gulf. The older generation could barely move, limping and leaning on canes. Young women were already participating in street demonstrations, studying at universities, and demanding equal rights. But in the villages, a different reality existed. A little girl cries as her mother tightens the bandages, blood soaking through the fabric. In the 1920s and 1930s, the fight against foot binding became part of the nationalist agenda. The Kuomintang government declared the practice a national disgrace, organized raids, and inspected families. Sometimes the police forced women to remove their bandages in the streets. But this forced reform had tragic consequences. For women whose feet were already permanently deformed, removing the bandages caused excruciating pain. Many lost the ability to walk altogether. Muscles and ligaments that had not been used for decades atrophied. Thus, women found themselves double victims, first crippled by tradition, then by violent reform. After 1949, the communists came to power, and foot binding was officially and permanently banned. Mao Zedong declared it a feudal relic. In a campaign to liberate women, the authorities organized mass inspections and fines for families who continued to bind their daughters' feet. In villages, commissars forced women to unfold their legs and burn their bandages. Textbooks wrote about the barbarism of old China. But the practice did not disappear instantly. Until the 1950s, girls in some rural areas continued to be bound secretly, hiding them from the eyes of officials. The grim reality was that even after the official ban, generations of women with deformed feet continued to live in villages for decades. In the 1950s, 1960s, and even the 1970s, it was possible to meet elderly women in China who could not walk without assistance. Their feet resembled charred, twisted fists. They sat at the doors of their homes, watching their daughters and granddaughters walk freely. And yet the symbolic power of this tradition remained. For many men, elderly women with lotus feet remained true beauties of the old days. Their shoes were kept in chests as relics and passed down from generation to generation. For the women themselves, it was a reminder of the pain and humiliation they had endured in order to be worthy. By the middle of the 20th century, foot binding had virtually disappeared, but the memory of it remained. The last generations of women who had undergone the ritual lived out their days sitting alone, with disfigured feet, that were no longer considered beautiful, merely a silent symbol of centuries of violence. There is a special silence in the way the last bearers of lotus feet die. They pass away in rural homes, surrounded by children and grandchildren who can walk freely in modern sneakers or shoes. And only out of politeness do they refrain from saying aloud what everyone knows. The deformity of their feet was the price they paid for someone else's ideals of beauty and obedience. The death of these women is not just the passing of a generation. It is the disappearance of living testimony to 1,000 years of torture. But the memory of foot binding does not fade. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren sometimes carefully preserve small embroidered shoes, delicate, bright, festive, but their beauty hides violence. Each shoe is like a relic, which is also a piece of evidence. In museums in Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing, there are entire display cases of shoes for bound feet, dozens of pairs, no longer than the palm of an adult's hand. Tour guides tell visitors about the 3 inches of gold and 1,000-year-old tradition. But when you look at them, all you can think about is the pain, blood, and pus that soaked into the bandages. Contemporary documentary filmmakers and photographers highlight the paradox. The women who survived foot binding sometimes said until the end of their lives that they were beautiful. Some of them smiled, showing their small, twisted feet, and claimed that it was thanks to them that they got married and were able to live a family life. This is not an excuse, but an acknowledgement of how deeply violence has become ingrained in their identity. Torture became the norm, mutilation a source of pride, and pain a part of a woman's destiny. But beyond personal stories, foot binding continues to function as a symbol, both in China and beyond. For feminist researchers, it is an example of how society can massively and systematically maim women in the name of male control. For historians, it is a unique case of cultural violence that lasted for almost 1,000 years. For the general public, it is a gruesome image of beauty created through bloodshed. In the 21st century, the memory of foot binding has become a tool for self-reflection for China. In official rhetoric, it is presented as a feudal relic, proof that the country has taken a step from darkness to progress. School textbooks tell girls and boys about how mothers broke their daughters' bones, and this is supposed to instill a sense of revulsion toward the old ways. At the same time, however, bandaging still retains an aura of refined antiquity on the fringes of culture. In some films and novels, lotus feet are portrayed as a symbol of refinement or secret passion. Souvenirs in the form of tiny shoes are sold in tourist shops. Even the memory of this violence is being commercialized. Meanwhile, the last witnesses are passing away. In the early 2000s, researchers estimated that there were several thousand women with bound feet living in China. In the 2010s, there were several hundred. Today, there are only a few. Each death erases another living voice. And when the last woman with lotus feet passes away, the world will be left with only artifacts, photographs, shoes, recordings. That is why today, documentary filmmakers are rushing to record every word these women say. Their stories are a chronicle of pain that must not be forgotten. And yet the most frightening thing is that foot binding is not unique. It is just one of many traditions in which the female body is turned into an object of control. In other countries, girls are still having their genitals mutilated, wives are condemned to be burned alive, and widows are turned into shadows. Chinese lotus feet are part of a global history of how culture can turn torture into beauty, mutilation into virtue, and suffering into the norm. The last women with bound feet are not just a memory of distant China. They are a warning that any tradition that justifies violence can last for centuries if society decides to call it beauty and honor. And when we look at their small, twisted feet, we hear not only the crunch of broken bones, but also the echo of all cultures where women's pain was turned into law.